The canyon swallowed sound, the way it swallowed light. But Royce Callahan still heard the broken breath drifting through the heat. He stepped closer to the narrow shelf of Blackthorn Canyon, expecting a dying animal, until he saw her pinned beneath a fallen slab of stone, dust clinging to her lashes like ash. Her skin glowed with the fever of sun and struggle, her breath thin, her eyes already choosing between fight and surrender. When his shadow crossed her, she lifted her face with the last of her strength, meeting him with a gaze sharp enough to cut through fear. Her lips parted, cracked and trembling, yet her voice came steady as a blade drawn under moonlight. "Make it quick. I won't scream." The words landed between them like a wound reopening. Royce froze, not from hesitation, but from the quiet horror of what life must have taught her. Then he knelt, hands closing around the edge of the stone, and said only, "I'm not here to hurt you." Behind them, the canyon held its breath, waiting to see which of them would break first. Before we continue, please take a moment to support the channel. A simple like, a quick comment, or hitting that subscribe button helps these Wild West tales reach more people who love them. Let me know where you're listening from, and thank you for riding along with us. Blackthorn Canyon lay carved into the Arizona territory like a scar the earth refused to hide. Heat lifted from the stone in wavering sheets, carrying the metallic scent of baked minerals in the sharp tang of juniper. Wind threaded through the razor-thin passageways, leaving behind a low hum that wove itself into the bones of anyone who lingered long enough. Royce Callahan had spent years listening to that hum, letting it replace the clamor of a world he no longer trusted. His cabin stood alone on the canyon's south rim, a squat structure of weathered pine and hand-cut stone, built not for comfort but for solitude. Smoke from his morning fire drifted upward, thin and reluctant, as if the canyon itself struggled to accept any sign of human life. When he lifted the fallen rock from the Apache woman and carried her from the canyon floor, he did so with the instinctive tension of someone who had long ago stopped letting people close. The moment her weight settled against him, light yet rigid with caution, he felt again the unwelcome pull of responsibility. The army had once trained him to follow orders without question. Life had taught him to question every order, every voice, every motive, including his own. Inside the cabin, the air held the scent of iron and dry sage. Royce laid her down on a pallet near the hearth, where the flicker of firelight washed over the dirt smudged across her cheekbones. She was young, though not so young that life had spared her. Her hair, black as obsidian dust, clung to her temples in tangled strands. Her wrists bore faint cuts from scrambling across sharp rock. Her eyes, when they opened, carried the wariness of someone accustomed to betrayal. She watched him like a creature caught between two choices, endure or escape, her breathing uneven but determined. She said nothing, and her silence was not fear but evaluation. Royce recognized it. He had worn the same silence when he turned his back on his old regiment and walked away from the flags, the orders, and the men who once stood beside him. A pale scar on his left wrist, just visible beneath the rolled cuff of his shirt, caught the firelight. He turned his hand slightly, hiding it without thinking. The cabin was small, and every movement made its presence known. The crackle of fire, the shift of her breath, the scrape of his boots as he stepped away to fetch water, all filled the space between them with meanings neither dared voice. Outside, the canyon exhaled, the wind pushing grit against the window pane in tiny, persistent taps. Royce handed her a tin cup and stepped back, keeping a respectful distance. She took it with both hands, though the tremor in her fingers betrayed her exhaustion. When the cool water touched her lips, her shoulders eased by a fraction. He noticed, but did not comment. "My name is Royce Callahan," he said quietly, unsure why he offered the information. She lifted her eyes briefly, acknowledging the words without responding. Names meant something different to people who had been hunted. Beyond the cabin walls, Ironwood Bluff sat 5 miles east, a town restless with suspicion and thirsty for certainty. Frontier rumors traveled faster than horses, and the sight of an Apache woman anywhere near its borders would stir questions neither Royce nor the woman lying before him wished to answer. She placed the empty tin on the dirt floor and finally spoke, her voice rough but steady. "I don't need your comfort." Royce nodded once. He understood. Comfort was a luxury for people who had not watched death reach into their homes. He tossed another piece of wood onto the fire, the sparks rising like fleeting stars before dissolving into shadow, and said, "I'm not offering comfort, just a place to breathe." Her eyes flickered, unreadable, and the canyon wind howled once through the chimney, as if in agreement that breath alone could sometimes mean survival. Night settled over Blackthorn Canyon with a slow, smoldering descent, turning the sky into a bruise-colored dome streaked with fading gold. Inside Royce Callahan's cabin, the fire cracked softly, pushing back just enough of the chill to keep the darkness from swallowing the room whole. Tanaya lay half upright against the wall, her leg wrapped in a strip of worn cloth, her hair falling loose around her face like a shadow refusing to be tamed. She had not taken her eyes off Royce since he carried her through his door. Her gaze was not fearful. Fear had burned out of her long ago. What remained was something sharper, a blade honed by survival. Royce moved quietly, steps measured, body angled away from her as if any sudden motion might fray the fragile truce between them. He lit a lantern, its glow softening the hard lines of his face. For a moment, Tanaya studied the way the light clung to him, the rigid set of his shoulders, the stillness in his jaw, the hollowed weariness in his eyes. She saw a man who had forgotten how to speak with more than necessity, a man who carried silence like a second skin. "Drink more," he said, setting another cup of water beside her. His voice remained even, careful in a way that suggested he'd spent years learning not to provoke. She hesitated, fingers brushing the cup, and in that hesitation, Royce caught the flicker of calculation behind her expression. She was remembering the canyon, the men, the blood she had seen spill before. She was wondering why this man chose to lift a stone instead of lifting a weapon. He looked at her leg, then met her eyes. "You'll walk again," he said. It was not reassurance, not comfort, just fact. Tanaya let out a breath, the faintest sound of disbelief hidden in it. "You know nothing about me," she murmured. "Enough," Royce replied. "Enough to see you fought harder than most men I knew." The words hung in the air, heavier than they seemed. Tanaya looked away first, her jaw tightening as though she resented the small warmth his honesty sparked in her. Outside, the canyon wind rose, sweeping past the cabin walls with a thin wail that made the flames tremble. Within that sound, Tanaya heard echoes of a night she had tried to outrun, horses screaming, fire snapping across roof beams, her mother's voice lost under the crash of rifles. Instinct seized her, and she jerked upright, eyes wide, breath shaking. Royce stepped toward her, only a fraction before stopping himself. His hands hovered at his sides, unsure whether distance or closeness would cause less harm. "It's just the wind," he said quietly. Tenaya pressed her palm to her ribs as though steadying her heartbeat. "Wind carries memory," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Royce did not ask what she meant. Questions were a kind of violence in their own way, and he would not force one on her. Instead, he sat on the floor near the hearth, far enough not to cage her, close enough that she did not feel alone. The fire painted his features in shifting tones of ember and shadow. Tenaya watched him through lashes still wet from memory. For a moment, the silence between them grew softer, less like a barrier and more like a bridge neither had expected. She broke it first. "You could have left me there." Royce did not look at her. "Should I have?" Tenaya considered the question, tracing the grain of the floorboards with her eyes before answering. Most men would have. Royce lifted his gaze then, the light catching the faint scar on his wrist. "I'm not most men." His tone held no pride, only the exhaustion of someone who had spent years fighting the part of himself the world insisted he become. Tenaya lay back slowly, her breath evening out, but her eyes remained fixed on him even as the fire dimmed. Royce turned away from her stare and fed the flames one last piece of wood. The sparks rose like fragile promises before vanishing into the seam of night above them. Neither spoke again, but something had shifted subtle, quiet, undeniable. The canyon outside moaned with the cold, but inside the cabin, two strangers lingered in the same breath of warmth, bound not by trust yet, but by the unmistakable awareness that their stories had begun to intertwine. Morning light crept into the cabin in thin, hesitant stripes, catching dust motes that drifted like slow-moving stars. Royce Callahan woke before the sun fully touched the canyon rim. Old habits, carved into him from years of marching, riding, refusing orders, had never faded. He brewed coffee over the fire, the bitter scent filling the room. Mingling with the faint aroma of the sage he kept near the windows to ward off insects. Behind him, Tenaya stirred. For a heartbeat, he froze, uncertain whether his presence would startle her. When she pushed herself upright without alarm, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Her leg was healing, though still stiff. When she tested her weight on it, a soft grimace crossed her face. Royce noticed but said nothing. Instead, he pointed to the chair by the table. "Sit. I'll bring food." Tenaya did not obey the instruction, but she accepted the offer, lowering herself slowly. He set a tin plate in front of her cornmeal mush, a handful of dried berries, the kind of food his years of solitude had taught him to survive on. She ate cautiously at first, as though unsure if kindness was something her body still recognized. Outside, the canyon warmed under the rising sun. A hawk circled overhead, its cry slicing through the morning hush. Royce stepped onto the porch, scanning the rim for movement. He had seen tracks the night before, boot prints, heavy and deliberate, not from Ironwood Bluff's ranchers. Someone skilled, someone who knew how to disappear between rock and shadow. When he stepped back inside, Tenaya's gaze met his, sharp and knowing. "He's close," she said. Royce didn't ask how she knew. He simply nodded. She glanced toward the door. "If you're afraid, you should send me away." Her voice was flat, but beneath it lingered something that sounded almost like resignation. Royce leaned against the table, arms folded, the scar on his wrist catching a sliver of light. "Afraid isn't the word," he said. "Cautious. Maybe, but not afraid. Tenaya studied him as though searching for a crack in his composure, finding none. She returned her attention to the food. Tracker Royce asked. She nodded once. "Hail, Thatcher," she said quietly, and the name settled in the air like dust from a closing grave. By afternoon, the wind picked up, dragging heat across the canyon in long, sighing waves. Tenaya stepped outside for the first time, steadying herself on the railing. Her hair lifted in the dry breeze. She scanned the jagged horizon with eyes trained to read land the way others read scripture. "I should leave," she murmured. "You've done enough. If I stay, he'll come for you too." Royce shook his head. He already did. Tenaya's brow furrowed. "Last night," Royce added, "arrow grazed me." Her expression flickered fear, guilt, anger before settling into the determined mask she wore like a second skin, without being asked. Tenaya gathered plants near the canyon wall yarrow leaves. Desert sage, a cluster of small white flowers whose Apache name she spoke like a whispered memory. She crushed them together with practiced ease. When she reached for Royce's arm, he instinctively pulled away. It wasn't the pain he had endured, far worse, but the unexpected intimacy of her touch. Tenaya didn't apologize. She simply waited. He extended his arm slowly. Her fingers were warm against his skin, and as she applied the salve, her breath brushed the inside of his elbow. He steadied himself, jaw tightening. The room felt smaller, the silence thicker. "You saved my life," he said quietly, surprising even himself. Tenaya didn't look up. "You saved mine first." There was no sentiment in her tone, only truth. When she finished, she tied the cloth securely and stepped back. Royce flexed his arm cautiously. The ache had dulled. He wanted to thank her, but the words snagged in his throat like thorns. Instead, he reached for his coat. "Come," he said. "You're not ready to walk far, but I can teach you to ride. It'll help if you need to run." The canyon opened wide as Royce led Midnight from the corral. The black horse, tall and broad-chested, snorted softly when Tenaya approached. She touched its muzzle gently, murmuring something in her language, a word Royce didn't know, but felt settle into him like a warmth. "He listens," she said. Royce lifted her onto the saddle, careful not to touch more than necessary. He walked beside her, one hand on the reins. "Lean forward on the climb," he said. "Let him feel your balance." Tenaya did as instructed, and Midnight responded with surprising ease. They rode past the scatter of cottonwood trees near the canyon's mouth, where the ground softened and the wind carried the scent of distant rain. At one point, Midnight stumbled slightly, and Tenaya gripped the saddle horn. Royce instinctively reached up, his hand brushing her knee. Both froze. The contact lasted less than a breath, but enough for the moment to ripple through them like lightning across a dark plain. Tenaya drew in a slow breath. Royce stepped back, clearing his throat. "You're a natural," he said. She gave him a faint, fleeting smile, the first he'd seen. As dusk approached, clouds gathered in thin veils along the horizon. Royce and Tenaya sat near the cabin, sharing a quiet meal. Coyotes called in the distance, their cries weaving through the rising night. Royce watched Tenaya as she hummed an Apache melody under her breath, a tune that belonged to fires older than the territory itself. The sound was soft but strong, carrying a weight he didn't understand, but longed to. She lifted her eyes, catching him listening. For once, she didn't look away. The canyon darkened, the fire between them glowing like a quiet heart. And though neither spoke the truth aloud, both felt it settling in the undeniable shift from strangers bound by circumstance to two souls beginning, cautiously, to belong to each other. Ironwood Bluff had always carried the smell of dry fear beneath its dust, the kind that seeped into the wooden boards of storefronts and the creases of men's faces. That fear woke early on the morning Hale Thatcher rode into town. His horse was caked with red earth, its flanks lathered with sweat, and the dark line across Thatcher's cheek looked like blood that had dried too fast. People stepped back as he passed, for there was a coldness to him that felt older than the desert itself. He tethered his horse at the water trough and walked straight towards Sheriff Warren Pike's office, each step leaving a small cloud of canyon dust behind. Inside, Pike listened in stiff silence as Thatcher spoke in a low, clipped voice. He had come hunting a woman, an Apache survivor of a raid gone wrong, a dangerous fugitive in his telling. Pike's brow tightened. The townsfolk would hear of this within the hour, and they would react as they always did, with suspicion first. Mercy last. "You're certain she's alive?" Pike asked. Thatcher's smile held no warmth. "Alive enough," he said. "And close." He tapped the dirt on his glove, leaving a trail across Pike's desk. Tracks lead toward the canyon. The rumor spread faster than wildfire moving against the wind. By noon, whispered words had turned into something sharper. A few men from the saloon claimed they'd seen Royce Callahan buying extra provisions 2 days earlier. Another swore he saw smoke rising from the canyon at dawn, and someone else remembered the way Royce had walked away from the army, saying he was soft on savages. Within hours, a small crowd gathered outside Pike's office, voices rising like a restless swarm. They wanted protection, clarity, justice, the kind defined by fear rather than truth. Back at Blackthorn Canyon, Tanaya felt the shift long before Royce did. She sensed it in the silence between the canyon walls, in the way the air tightened as evening crept down from the cliffs. She had grown up reading land the way others read scripture, and now every instinct told her danger was moving toward them. Royce's voice reached her from the other side of the cabin. "You're uneasy." She didn't deny it. "Thatcher's closer," she said. "Closer than you think." Royce stepped outside, scanning the canyon rim, his jaw clenched. The prints he'd seen the night before hadn't been random wanderer tracks. They had purpose, they had weight, and they were multiplying. Near sunset, Sheriff Pike appeared at the edge of the clearing, his horse sweating under the strain of a hard ride. He dismounted slowly, as though afraid his presence alone might crack whatever fragile peace held at the cabin. "Royce," he said, removing his hat, "we need to talk." Tanaya watched from the doorway, her hand lightly gripping the edge of the frame. Royce didn't look back at her. "Go on," he said to Pike. The sheriff's shoulders sagged under the burden of what he carried. "Word's out," Pike said. "They think you're hiding someone. They want me to bring her in. They won't wait long." Royce's voice remained calm. "She hasn't harmed anyone." Pike rubbed a hand across his face, eyes closing briefly. "That won't matter once the mob's riled. They're frightened. Royce, frightened people make bad decisions." Royce stepped forward, jaw working. "And what'll you do?" Pike swallowed hard. "I'll stall them, as long as I can. But you need to be ready. They're coming." The sheriff left the way he came, and as the sound of hoofbeats faded, Tanaya moved to stand beside Royce. For a moment, neither spoke. The sky burned orange behind the canyon's jagged rim, casting their shadows long across the dust. "You should let me go," she said quietly. "If I stay, it'll be you they hurt." Royce didn't turn toward her, but his voice was steady. "I won't hand you to Thatcher, or to anyone else." Tanaya's breath caught. She opened her mouth to argue, but Royce lifted a hand, silencing her. "I've seen what men like him do. I've seen what fear does to good towns." His gaze drifted toward Ironwood Bluff's distant outline. "No one deserves to be hunted just for surviving." Night deepened, and with it came the sound of distant hoofbeats. This time, the riders didn't bother hiding their approach. Lanterns bobbed like angry fireflies as they made their way toward the cabin. Royce tightened the strap of his holster, though he didn't draw. Tanaya stood by the fire, face composed, though her fingers twitched with the memory of flight. When the townsmen reached the clearing, dust swirling around their boots, Royce stepped forward. Sheriff Pike was among them. Expression grim. The man at the front, Dale Horwick, a rancher known for letting fear speak louder than reason, raised his voice. "Callahan," he said, "we're here for the Apache woman. Hand her over, and no one needs to get hurt." Royce didn't move. No, the word fell heavy. Final. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A man at the back shouted, "She's dangerous! Let the law deal with her." Royce's eyes darkened. The law. His voice dropped to something deeper, older. The law executed unarmed families while I was still wearing their uniform. A stunned hush fell. Royce rarely spoke of the army, but now the truth poured from him like a blade pulled free. "I won't repeat their mistake," he said. "You want her, you'll have to step over me." The tension snapped taut as a bowstring. Hands hovered near holsters. Lantern flames shook. For a heartbeat, violence hung inches above the ground. Then Sheriff Pike raised both hands. "Enough," he said. "No one's dying tonight." He met Royce's eyes with a weary, silent plea. After a long moment, the crowd grudgingly backed away, scattering into the darkness with angry mutters and lingering threats. When the last light faded and only the whisper of canyon wind remained, Royce stood with his shoulders drawn tight, breath ragged. Tenaya approached him slowly, the fire behind her casting her in faint halos of gold. Her voice was low, trembling not with fear, but something deeper. "You stood for me," she said, "when no one ever has." Royce turned his head, meeting her gaze beneath the weight of what nearly happened. "I stood because it was right." But Tenaya saw what he didn't say, what he couldn't say. For the first time since leaving the army, he had chosen someone. And for the first time since losing her people, she didn't feel alone. Long after the hoofbeats faded and the angry lantern lights dissolved into the night, silence settled over Blackthorn Canyon like a protective shroud. The air was cold enough to sting the lungs, and every exhale from the cabin door rose in pale spirals before drifting away. Royce Callahan stood alone for a time, staring into the darkness as though expecting the mob to return. His shoulders remained tense, as if braced for the next blow the world might deliver. Only when the coyotes' distant calls filled the canyon again did he allow the breath inside his chest to release, slow and heavy. Tenaya watched him from the doorway, the firelight at her back casting her shadow across the porch. She stepped forward without a word. Her leg had grown steadier over the past days, but she leaned slightly to one side as she walked, a reminder of the stone that had nearly crushed her life into silence. Royce didn't turn, but he sensed her presence the way a seasoned rider senses the weight shift before a horse bolts. She stopped beside him, close enough for their arms to share the same cold air. "You can breathe now," she murmured. Royce let out a small, bitter sound that was not quite a laugh. "Feels like I forgot how." He rubbed a hand over his face, wiping away the dust and sweat left from the confrontation. When he lowered his hand, Tenaya's gaze was waiting for him, steady and unreadable. Her expression held no fear now, only questions. And something else, something softer, though still guarded, like a flame protected by cupped hands. "You didn't have to stand for me," she said. Royce shook his head. "I did." Why? The word was quiet, but sharp. A blade of honesty she held between them. He hesitated. The truth sat deep in him, a stone lodged where no surgeon's knife could reach. "Because I've seen what happens when men choose to look away," he said. "And I've seen what becomes of the ones they choose not to see." He turned slightly, enough for the firelight from the cabin to illuminate the pale scar along his wrist. Tenaya's eyes lingered on it, as if recognizing a mark she once bore somewhere inside herself. Royce spoke again, more slowly this time. "I once held a rifle under the command of men who called themselves just. They told us those people were threats. Told us they'd strike first if we didn't." He swallowed. "They were wrong, and I knew it. I refused an order one night." His voice thinned, like old leather stretched too tight. "They tied me to a post for that refusal. Said a night in the cold would teach obedience." Tenaya felt her breath catch. The night wind brushed past both of them, cold as memory. Royce looked away, jaw tight. "I learned the wrong lesson," he said. "Or maybe the right one. I learned not to trust the men who claimed righteousness." For a long moment, Tenaya said nothing. Then she took a step closer, turning her body toward him. "My village burned because men like that believed the same lies," she whispered. "Men who said we were danger just because we lived on land they wanted." Her voice wavered at the end, but she forced it still. "I ran until my feet bled. I didn't stop until the canyon swallowed me." Royce's head bowed slightly, not in pity, but in understanding so complete it left no space for words. Tenaya lowered herself onto the edge of the porch, wincing as her leg bent. Royce sat beside her, leaving enough space for her to move away if she wished. She didn't, for a while. They watched the canyon together. The moon hung low, washing the stone walls in pale silver. The fire inside the cabin flickered behind them, breathing warmth onto their backs. Tenaya broke the silence first. "You risked yourself for me," she said. "Not out of debt, not out of duty." She paused, searching his face. "Why does that frighten me more than the men who came tonight?" Royce looked at her then, really looked, and the canyon seemed to inhale. "Because it means you're not alone anymore," he said. "And that's harder to face than danger." Tenaya's lips parted, a quiet breath escaping. Her hand rested loosely on her knee, fingers curled as though she were holding onto something invisible. Royce didn't reach for her. He simply waited. After a long moment, her hand drifted slightly, until the back of her fingers brushed the side of his. It was barely a touch, barely contact at all, but it felt like the first green shoot breaking through scorched earth. They stayed that way, sharing the night, the silence, the fragile truth stitched between them. Above, the canyon wind softened, sliding through the pines like a weary traveler settling into rest. And for the first time in a long time, Royce Callahan felt the world loosen its hold on him. Inside, he sensed something shifting, small, steady, and impossibly hopeful. Dawn crept over Blackthorn Canyon like a slow breath returning to a tired body, its first light spilling across the jagged rim in strokes of soft gold. The land, so harsh beneath the midday sun, now seemed gentler, almost fragile in the pale morning hush. Royce Callahan stepped outside, boots sinking into the cool dust as the last stars faded. He'd barely slept, but for the first time in years, his weariness felt lighter, as though something inside him had shifted during the long hours he'd spent sitting beside Tenaya beneath the moon. She emerged from the cabin moments later, leaning on the doorframe for balance before walking toward him with careful steps. The wind tugged at the ends of her hair, lifting the loose strands as if welcoming her back into the world. When she reached him, she paused, letting her gaze sweep across the canyon, the same canyon that had nearly taken her life, the same canyon that had given her refuge. "It looks different in the morning," she said quietly. Royce nodded. "Most things do." They stood together in the silence that followed, neither rushing to fill it. A hawk lifted from a nearby ledge, wings cutting through the warming air, rising higher until it disappeared into the pale sky. Tenaya watched it, eyes narrowing slightly as though she recognized something of herself in the steady arc of its flight. The bird vanished behind a slab of stone, leaving only the echo of its call drifting across the basin. Royce drew a slow breath. "You're free to go," he said, forcing the words past the roughness in his throat. "If you want. I won't keep you here." Tenaya turned her head toward him, studying the man who had lifted a stone off her broken leg, who had stood in front of a mob, who had let her sit in silence until silence became something shared instead of feared. Her voice came soft but firm. "I've been running so long I forgot what it felt like to stop." She stepped closer, not touching him, simply closing the distance. "I'd like to stay, if you want me here." Royce didn't answer at once. He looked out across the canyon, where a single wildflower had forced its way up through a crack in the stone, its petals trembling in the morning breeze. The sight stirred something deep and old in him. "Then we stay," he said, "and we build something new, one stone at a time." The sun lifted fully above the rim, washing the cabin, the canyon, and the two figures standing together in a warmth that felt like a promise.